Why is Japan, the birthplace of matcha, struggling to supply its own tea ceremonies? In early 2025, export volumes surged by more than 85% year-on-year, while traditional farms bound by strict growing seasons and an aging workforce couldn't keep pace. The result is a shortage affecting both local culture and cafes around the world. I'm Alexander and I studied Japan at both undergraduate and master's levels. In this video, we will look at why demand outpaces supply, how production is constrained, who's feeling the impact, and whether matcha can fully recover. But to understand that, we need to look at where matcha began. How did a revered tea, once reserved for centuries-old ceremonies, become a pastel green symbol of global lifestyle culture? For centuries in Japan, matcha was central to the tea ceremony, a practice called chanoyu. This wasn't just about drinking tea, it was an art form with a precise order of movements, a focus on seasonal aesthetics, and a deep connection to Zen philosophy. Only powdered tea from the highest quality shade-grown leaves was acceptable, and it was prepared in a way that balanced taste, visual beauty, and mindfulness. The tools were specific, the setting deliberate, and the tea itself carried the weight of cultural meaning. For much of the 20th century, people outside Japan rarely encountered matcha at all. That changed gradually, and then suddenly very quickly. Over the past decade, matcha moved from exclusive Japanese tea rooms to cafe menus around the world. It appeared in lattes, soft serve ice cream, chocolate truffles, pancake mixes, and even skincare products. At this point, anything you can think of, there's probably a matcha version of it. And social media just amplified that trend further. Matcha's vivid green colors stood out in Instagram and TikTok posts, often paired with clean ceramics and minimalist interiors. Health-conscious consumers were drawn to the claims about antioxidants and sustained energy without the crash that's associated with coffee, cementing its place in the so-called superfood category. The rising interest showed clearly in trade data. By 2023, Japanese matcha exports reached about 29.2 billion yen, nearly double the 2019 figure, alongside a rapid increase in international demand for premium grades. The shift meant that regions like Kyoto's Uji, historically the source for ceremonial matcha in Japan, were no longer supplying only domestic tea schools. They now served major coffee chains, boutique dessert brands, and overseas retailers aiming to keep their shelves stocked. Unlike sushi, which was adapted relatively easily to local ingredients and faster preparation methods, as it spread globally, matcha production remains tightly bound to traditional constraints. You see, ceremonial-grade matcha requires tea plants to be shaded for several weeks before harvest to deepen the flavor, followed by steaming, drying, and grinding the leaves in a process that has hardly changed for centuries. Even the grinding is a bottleneck in and of itself. Using a stone mill, it can take around 1 hour to produce just 30 grams of finished powder, without overheating or damaging the flavor. As matcha entered cafes and product lines worldwide, its role shifted. What had long been seen as a symbol of refinement and ritual in Japan also became an ingredient for sweet drinks, flavored snacks, and beauty treatments. The cultural meaning didn't disappear, but the context in which matcha appeared diversified, and with that came competing demands on the same finite supply. High-volume overseas orders began to run alongside the needs of traditional tea ceremonies, creating points of strain. This growing tension revealed two opposing forces: an expanding global appetite for matcha in all its forms, and the natural logistical and cultural limits to producing authentic ceremonial matcha. Farming cycles, the need for skilled labor, and the pace of processing all restrict how much can realistically be made in each year. Even if more fields could be planted, they need the right climate, soil, and time to mature, making rapid expansion difficult. The surge of the past few years was more than a boost to Japan's agricultural exports. It laid the groundwork for the supply squeeze facing both global and domestic markets today. Increased demand from abroad meant domestic shelves in Japan started feeling the impact even sooner, and traditional buyers suddenly found themselves competing with international cafes and retailers. And here in the next part, we will see how shifts in currency, tourism patterns, and buying behavior intensified that competition and pushed the matcha market into uncharted territory. The yen's weakness in 2023 and 2024 made luxury matcha often significantly cheaper for foreign buyers, creating a perfect incentive for on-site purchases in Japan. With inbound tourism reaching a record 37 million visitors in 2024, the effect was amplified. Many tourists began treating matcha the same way they treated electronics or regional snacks, filling entire suitcases with tins to take home or resell. This surge in direct, high-volume buying was soon labeled matcha tourism by local media. At the same time, global consumption was already pressing against production limits. Specialty cafes in North America, Europe, and Asia increasingly promoted ceremonial-grade Japanese matcha as a premium differentiator, often referencing uji matcha or Japanese shade-grown matcha in their menus. Many of these overseas buyers secured supply through advance contracts, locking in bulk orders before the height of tourism season. This left even less stock available for domestic customers by the time the visitors arrived in person. Retailers inside Japan quickly felt the squeeze. From mid-2024, some specialty shops in Kyoto and Tokyo began limiting customers to a single can of matcha, while others paused sales entirely until they could restock. For domestic buyers, especially tea ceremony practitioners and small local cafes, it became routine to find sold-out notices where shelves had once been predictably stocked. The pattern unfolded across multiple producing regions, not only in Kyoto's Uji, but also in Shizuoka and Kagoshima, as tea brands redirected finite supplies toward export channels, offering higher per kilogram prices. Now, the pressure was not confined to Japan's borders. Shops and producers themselves reported mass sellouts. One Los Angeles matcha bar, Kettle Tea, it had only 4 of its usual 25 varieties in stock at one point. In Japan's Sayama region, producer Masahiro Okutomi temporarily stopped accepting new matcha orders to preserve supply for existing customers. These on-the-ground realities underscored how quickly rising demand could outstrip even well-established production lines. Core groups further intensified the strain. Reports from Uji described buses arriving with visitors intent on bulk purchases, sometimes leaving entire store displays bare within a single afternoon. In cases like these, the buyers weren't browsing for a single souvenir, they were calculating purchase limits, buying the allowance, and often adding extra luggage to the trip home. For longtime residents of tea-producing towns, the result was a strange and, I imagine, frustrating experience, living in the heart of matcha country yet unable to source their preferred tea locally. Global trade patterns added another layer of fragility. In certain markets, tariffs or agricultural import restrictions already limited the volume of Japanese tea entering the country. For those consumers, personal travel to Japan or informal distribution networks became the only realistic way to secure high-quality matcha. This made every yen movement, every export order, and every tourist season a potential disruptor of the supply. In the span of just a couple of years, a set of converging forces, favorable exchange rates for foreign buyers, record inbound tourism, aggressive export contracting, and limited domestic quotas, had pushed Japan's matcha economy into a new and volatile phase. Even when these external market factors fluctuated, one unchanging reality remained. Matcha could not be produced at will to meet sudden spikes in demand. That underlying constraint would prove to be the real challenge. The limits are set long before matcha reaches a tin or a cafe counter. And understanding those limits is the key to seeing why simply making more is far from straightforward. Expanding Japan's tea fields to meet the soaring matcha demand might sound straightforward, but matcha is made only from tencha leaves, grown under shade for a set period before harvest. Farmers construct coverings of black mesh or rice straw to block out most of the sunlight, slowing photosynthesis and boosting chlorophyll. This creates the vivid green color and the umami flavor of high-quality matcha. The shading must be timed exactly, as must the harvest. If leaves are picked too early or too late, flavor and aroma decline noticeably. For the highest ceremonial grades, there is only one narrow spring window, the first flush as it's called, when the plant's stored nutrients are at their peak. This cycle can't be accelerated with technology or duplicated in another season, which means quality matcha is just naturally scarce. In fact, only about 6% of all tea harvested in Japan ends up as matcha. Climate change has made even this limited window unpredictable. Warmer springs can cause plants to bud earlier than usual, increasing the risk that a late frost will damage delicate shoots. Just a few cold days in April can ruin an entire year's first flush. At the other end of the season, hotter, more humid summers reduce the new leaf growth and lower the amino acid levels that give matcha its smooth taste. These conditions can further downgrade later harvests, which are already lower in quality compared to the spring yield, tightening supply at all the different grade levels. Labor shortages add another layer of difficulty. Tea cultivation demands precise, hands-on skill, positioning shade structures, plucking leaves without bruising, steaming and drying them correctly. The average age of Japan's tea farmers is now among the highest of any in the agricultural sector, and the workforce has shrunk dramatically, from over 54,000 in the year 2000 to about 20,000 by 2025. Few younger workers are entering the trade, and training replacements takes years. So without skilled hands, expanding production while maintaining quality becomes almost impossible. Processing capacity is also a bottleneck. Tencha must be ground into powder at a slow pace to preserve quality. Faster grinding generates heat, degrading the flavor and the aroma compounds. Stone grinding can take about an hour to produce 30 grams of powder, roughly enough for a small consumer tin. Facilities already run near maximum capacity during peak harvest, and increasing output would require significant investment in both machinery and trained operators. But even then, grinding can only follow the pace set by the seasonal harvests. The Japanese government has begun responding. The Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries has revised its plans and introduced subsidies for shading systems, processing equipment, and capacity expansion. But experts agree that scaling high-quality matcha will still take years because of fixed seasonal cycles, limited arable land, and the time needed to develop skilled labor. When all of these constraints combine, finite harvest windows, climate instability, labor shortages, and slow processing, the result is a system where genuine matcha cannot simply be produced on demand. Economic pressures push some producers toward lower grade blends or faster methods, and the small share of the crop that meets ceremonial grade becomes even more contested. These pressures are not just economic. They create conditions where authenticity and tradition come under threat. As long established users of ceremonial matcha find themselves competing with buyers far removed from the practice's origins. That tension is now being felt most acutely in the places where matcha's cultural meaning has been preserved the longest. When shortages reach this level, the impact is not just economic. It touches the traditions and practices that depend on genuine ceremonial grade matcha. In Japan, long-established tea ceremony schools that have operated for generations are now facing disruptions, from rationing their supply of ceremonial grade matcha to adjusting class schedules when they can't secure enough matcha. Even venerable brands such as Ippodo and Marukyu Koyamaen exhausted some of their matcha lines in 2024, forcing specialty shops and ceremony schools to impose purchase limits or halt sales altogether. For students in training where every detail, down to the exact hue of the green in the bowl, carries cultural weight, these interruptions go beyond a temporary inconvenience. Scarcity also creates the perfect opening for lower quality alternatives. Because high-grade matcha requires the precise shading and careful grinding, the supply is slow to replenish. As prices rise, the market sees more blends cut with sencha powder, products boosted with green food coloring, or powders imported from regions that do not follow Japan's detailed growing and handling standards. In a few cases, imported powders were flagged for pesticide residues or even safety concerns. So if you're buying matcha, you should be cautious. Though these are exceptions rather than the rule, the bigger issue for most consumers is that packaging and branding often use Japanese characters or imagery to imply origin, making it harder for those untrained buyers to distinguish between authentic Japanese ceremonial matcha and products of lower quality or a different origin altogether. For those experienced with real ceremonial grade matcha, certain traits stand out. The powder should have a luminous, vivid green color, a result of proper shading and immediate steaming after harvest. Its texture is ultra fine, almost like silk to the touch, without visible granules. When whisked, it produces a thick, even foam that persists for several minutes. Flavor should balance a natural sweetness with deep umami, avoiding sharp bitterness. These cues help, but many casual consumers won't notice the difference, which opens room for lower grade or mislabeled products to compete with the real thing. In tea-producing regions, adapting to demand is not always possible, even when the will is there. Expanding shading infrastructure involves significant costs for large mesh coverings, their seasonal upkeep, along with the trained labor to erect and manage them. For smaller farms run by aging farmers, the investment risk is considerable, especially in rural areas with shrinking populations where hiring additional workers is already a challenge. Many of these farms maintain their existing capacity rather than attempt to scale, even if that means losing out on potential high-margin sales. The cultural cost is harder to measure, but deeply felt. The Japanese tea ceremony is an integrated art form, tied not only to the preparations of the tea, but also to seasonal sweets, flower arrangements, and the precise choreography of serving. A host might select a particular matcha to align with the season or the event's theme. When that tea is unavailable, these layers of meaning are disrupted. For teachers or hosts, welcoming guests from overseas, explaining why a carefully chosen seasonal tea is missing, can undermine the sense of authenticity the experience is meant to convey. Outside Japan, the pull of authenticity remains strong. Cafes and specialty stores in cities from London to Singapore promote uji matcha for its association with quality. But rising prices and production limits mean some now operate on waitlists, fulfilling orders only when harvests and milling schedules allow. Even well-funded businesses struggle to secure a year-round supply without gaps. Meeting this demand without sacrificing cultural integrity will require careful decisions about which aspects of production can adapt and which must remain unchanged. The resolution will shape both the market and the survival of the rituals that give matcha its identity, a reminder of what can happen when growing global appetites meet the limits of tradition. So looking at the full picture, 5 forces come together to create today's shortage, including rapid global demand and export growth, the weak yen and the tourism surge, climate volatility, which reduces the first flush yields, an aging and shrinking farmer workforce, and the grinding and processing capacity limits. Each factor reinforces the others, leaving little short-term flexibility. The Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries has introduced subsidies and revised plans to encourage more tencha cultivation. But officials warn that quality-focused expansion will take years. Unlike matcha with its limited supply, Japanese researchers have found a way to turn trees or wood into drinkable alcohol, meaning a near endless supply. But to learn more about how and why this awesome innovation matters, you can check out this video next. Until next time, see ya.